Last week we began a short series moving towards Christmas, and as we turn to thinking about the birth of Jesus. There's so many ways to phrase it: the birth of Jesus, the arrival of God with us, the incarnation, lots of different words. And for some of us, Christmas has a complicated place in our lives. You may or may not be aware of the history, but if you go on the internet and you do a search, does Christian have pagan origins? Christmas have pagan origins? You'll find all sorts of articles, one way or another, and so it didn't really get celebrated in a very big way in church history for a couple of centuries. They started celebrating annually the death of Jesus a lot earlier, and then later on started celebrating the birth of Christ. Because of that sort of delayed celebration, there were some in history that have at times cancelled Christmas, and so in England there were periods of time where a group of people, a political party or religious group, the Puritans, took over, and so they, at that point in time, apparently the office Christmas parties had gotten completely out of hand, and their response was, nobody celebrates Christmas, and so they just ended it. And that was Oliver Cromwell, if you're looking for a name to put with that. But after the Puritans lost their influence, by popular demand, Christmas was brought back, the celebration of it. Jesus had still been born regardless, but it was brought back at that point in time. But then when groups of people came to the United States, before it was the United States, and started settling, Europeans started settling here, there was disagreement about whether such joy and frivolity belonged as part of this new society. And so if you came to Plymouth, Christmas was banned. If you went to Jamestown, you had a good time, okay? And you could celebrate Christmas there. And so throughout history there's been kind of this tension. For some of us, maybe we have that similar tension. I know that when I first arrived in the United States in 1999, last century, the school I attended had several students there from overseas, and they were either Americans that had been missionaries over there, children of missionaries, or had come to be trained for ministry. And the dean of the school, who himself was a child of a missionary, his family had actually grown up in Nazareth, planting a church for Palestinian Christians there in Nazareth. And he invited this group of international students over to his house for dinner, and it was around Christmas. And during the conversation we realized that none of our families had celebrated Christmas. And when I say had celebrated Christmas, I don't just mean in church on Sunday, I mean anywhere. It was as though it was blank on the calendar. And we were a product of a period in Churches of Christ, at least amongst ministry and missionary families, where Christmas was viewed with great suspicion. And for some of us here today, this seems like the strangest thing ever. Shouldn't the ministers and missionaries and leaders of the church be the ones promoting and encouraging the birth of Christ and the importance of that and celebrating that. You think of Christmas and you think of church. You think of a Christian holiday. So why would a church not participate? Well, there's no particular answer, single answer to that. But a couple of reasons that you might hear are that there's no biblical command to celebrate the birth of Christ, like there is to take the Lord's Supper each Sunday. We might also be told that, at least the one I heard a lot, was about the pagan origins, the so-called pagan origins of Christmas. And there were others who would simply regard it as too Catholic, and therefore if it's Catholic, it's wrong. So I'm not going to break down those today, okay? I've been to enough church services where you went to church on Christmas and got told why Christmas shouldn't be celebrated. It's not a particularly encouraging Christmas day. And so I'm not going to replicate that, except to say that obviously myself and the elders here at Lawson Road don't find those arguments, those points, those lines of thinking particularly persuasive. Okay? And so we're willing to celebrate the birth of Jesus. As much as the globe celebrates Christmas, not just Christians, but the globe, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to share an important part of the gospel message. And honestly, in my experience, if we don't talk about it and celebrate it at Christmas, we almost never talk about it and celebrate it. And the idea of God becoming flesh and living amongst us becomes a footnote to our faith. One way that I do think, though, that Christmas can be confusing is that today in our world there are really two Christmases. Okay. The first one is what we might call the cultural Christmas. And cultural Christmas shows up in our media. It shows up with Santa and the reindeer, with decorations and Christmas trees, family meals, gifts, Hallmark movies, a time to serve others, songs about snow and the spirit of Christmas, about love and joy. And everybody can feel good about those things. But there's nothing particularly religious about that. There's some crossover, right? Christians appreciate snow as much as anyone when we're looking out the window at it, right? We enjoy the Christmas music, right? It's okay if you're a Christian and you enjoy Jingle Bells, right? It's okay to be generous at Christmas just because everyone else is. It's okay to give gifts, to get together with family. These things, to talk about love and joy at this time of year. They're all good things that any of us can do. But there is also, I believe, this what I call a Christian Christmas. And this focuses on the story of Jesus' birth. And it features not Santa and Rudolph, but Mary and Joseph, shepherds and magi, an evil king, fulfilled prophecy, love, joy, hope, peace, Christmas carols that talk about Christ and his birth and God's plan for humanity, and the message of good news, God is with us. And so sometimes we can look at the consumerism and the excesses of the cultural Christmas and say, well, Christians shouldn't have anything to do with that. Okay, the office parties are getting too wild again. And in doing that, we give up the Christian message and celebration of what God has done for us. And so there are times these two celebrations overlap. And that's not a bad thing. Radio stations that never play anything Christian, in fact, radio stations that spend most of the year playing things that are kind of contrary to Christianity and God's moral standards, will at this time of year mix in a song about Jesus' birth. Likewise, as a church that exists within culture, we enjoy, as I said, those things on the left side of that list. As Christians, we get to choose whether or not we're going to use this season on the calendar to help us focus our thoughts on Christ, or if we'll be carried away and caught up in the consumerism of everyone else. For instance, there are all sorts of devotionals available. If you look at my office door as you come in, you'll see just very short devotionals for every day of December leading up to Christmas. And this kind of practice can help give us a focus in our walk with Christ and our relationship with God. And so when I talk about Christmas here at Lawson Road or in a church service, most of the time I'm using the word as a shorthand way of saying everything in the right-hand column. Because you don't want me to say, isn't this a great season to be thinking about Mary and Joseph and Jesus and the shepherds and the Magi and the manger and the stable and the incarnation and the fulfilled prophet? Like, you don't want me to say it. You just say, isn't it a great time to be celebrating Christmas and the birth of Christ? And it encapsulates all of that. And that's why we do it that way. Nonetheless, there are some misconceptions around the story of Christmas. And we talked last week about the messiness or the difficulties of Jesus' birth. From Mary needing to explain her miraculous pregnancy to family and friends. From Joseph needing to accept Mary and the angel's explanation about her miraculous pregnancy. From Joseph trying to sort through his new role, or his role in this new family dynamic that he wasn't expecting. To the journey to Bethlehem, just before she gives birth. To the birth of Jesus itself. Very little went smoothly or to plan. There was a lot that was complicated, that was messy. And so we celebrate the messiness of Christmas. Today I want to look a little further afield than just Jesus and his parents. We read earlier from the book of Matthew the story of the Magi traveling from the east to see a newborn king. And it's interesting, if you just read Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, it's not very celebratory. Like, thank goodness we have Luke. Because without Luke, there's no shepherds, there's no angels, there's no glory to God in the highest. There's no Magnificat of Mary praising God. There's no Zechariah, John the Baptizer's father, and the miraculous birth of him. And like all of that stuff that we're familiar with is missing. If we just go with Matthew, we get an angel having an awkward conversation with Joseph. We have Jesus being born, and we have the story of the Magi. And although our Christmas presentations, when we talk about the Magi or the wise men, usually focus on the gifts that they give, that's not what Matthew concentrates on, is it? Matthew concentrates on the suffering and the hardship that the Magi really brought with them. It seems at first like it's a good thing that these Magi have traveled for the birth of Jesus. We don't know where they come from. They in all likelihood, didn't really know the God of Israel. They're probably wise men, sort of over from, could be from Babylon, could be from further afield, and they look at the stars, they look at animal entrails, they discern things, they're advisors to foreign kings. And yet this star gets their attention. And they say, there's a king that's being born. We know that star. You and I might see that same star and we'll just go, boy, that star's bright tonight. And they're looking at it, and because of their background and their understanding of how the stars work, of the zodiac and all that sort of stuff, things that we may not even support today, they say, we're going to go and follow that star. It's moving. Let's go find this king. It's surely a significant king if the king has a star in the sky. And so they take off. And already it's messy. Because don't we want the Magi to be like, I don't know, priests of God? Like they're sort of Jews in hiding in these foreign countries worshipping, the holy God of Israel. And instead they're Gentiles, engaged in magic and whatever, advising kings that maybe are enemies, that are brutal, but God uses them to say, come and meet my king. And they follow this star, and they do what really we would expect everyone to do. They arrive in Judea, and it could have been as much as 2 years after Jesus' birth. We don't really know when. We don't know if God timed the star for them to arrive when Jesus was born, or if he timed the star at the moment he was born and then they started driving. Yeah? We don't know exactly how that worked. But they come to Judea. They come to Jerusalem. And isn't that the natural place that you go? You're following the star. It's not very precise. Stars tend not to be precise if you're following them. There's a lot up there. They sort of lead you to the general region. And they go to Jerusalem because they're looking for a king. And so you go to the palace if you're looking for a king, don't you? I imagine they're a little surprised as they come into town and there isn't much celebration going on. No giant posters celebrating the new arrival of a prince. But they go to the palace and they talk to the king on the throne. And little could they have imagined the chain of events that this would set off. Because the king on the throne was Herod the Great. He's not great because he's great. He's great because he builds things, and also maybe he gets to name himself, I don't know. But he builds great things. And so he's not called Herod the Great Builder, he's just called Herod the Great, but he's not great. Herod is paranoid. Herod is brutal. Herod will kill later on his own family in order to maintain his grip on the throne. And now these wise men have come and they're telling the king that there's another rival to the throne. How do you expect him to react? You see, Herod wasn't even a Jew. He was what we would call an Edomite. And he had managed to manipulate the Roman government, the political system, to being appointed king over Jerusalem and Judea. And so he consulted with his Jewish advisors, religious advisors, the priests, and the other, the scribes and scholars there in Jerusalem. He says, okay, what's all this talk about a king? I don't know if he was aware of the prophecies. I don't know if he was aware that people were looking for a Messiah. But he says, if a king was going to be born, is there anything that God has told us or told you about that? Well, they know their scriptures. Whatever we might say about the Pharisees, about the chief priests, one thing we can say for sure is they knew their scriptures. Because I don't know about you or me. I know about me. I don't know about you. If somebody came to me and said, where's the Messiah going to be born? I'd be like, yeah, that's a good question. But these guys couldn't identify just the good question. They knew the good answer. And they said, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Not far, small town, not far from Jerusalem. And so Herod tries to manipulate the Magi to bring him information about this new rival. When God intervened and made sure that that message never got back to Herod, ruthlessly he orders the murder of all male toddlers in Bethlehem under the age of 2. Now, I don't know what your image of Bethlehem or that event is. Hopefully you don't even have too many images of that. But Bethlehem wasn't a big town. This may have been 10, 20, 50 children. It's not hundreds or thousands. But it's not as though saying, oh, it's only 10, 20 or 50 children means it's okay. There's still 10, 20 or 50 families that are grieving, that have lost their child. And it's not just those parents or the siblings that are grieving. The town as a whole is just going to be devastated, aren't they? To have that happen. I mean, they lived in a different time, but the familial bonds of parents and children, of a community, of supporting one another, watching children in the neighborhood grow up and take over the corner store that their dad ran, or the farm, or they all contributed to each other's success. And now, it's not a generation, but it's this 2-year gap of children that are just gone. I can't imagine the trauma that event caused. And we could say that they're devastated by the violent deaths in their community because the Prince of Peace, who brought tidings of great joy, happened to be born in their town. Matthew chapter 2, we read this, but verse 18, I think captures the feeling of this event. And in Matthew, this is the last verse, the last statement concerning Jesus' birth. In Ramah, it's a quote, so the original quote was referring to a different event, but in Ramah a voice was heard crying and weeping loudly. Rachel was mourning for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were dead. And that's where the story of Jesus' birth ends, in Matthew's Gospel. It's not really a high point, is it? It's sort of uncomfortable that we stop here. Rachel, if you're wondering, is one of the matriarchs of Israel. If we go all the way back, there was Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Rachel. Just before we get to Joseph and going down to Egypt. And so Rachel is seen as this matriarch centuries before, crying over her nation because of the grief and the hardship because her children are dead. You see, Jesus' birth didn't just disrupt the lives of his immediate family. It sent shudders through Herod's palace. It made the Magi change their travel plans. Not a big problem in the overall context, I get it. It devastated the families of Bethlehem. And it uprooted the family of Jesus as he fled to Egypt as a political refugee. And we can look at this story and we can say, if Jesus hadn't been born, the Magi wouldn't have traveled. And if the Magi hadn't traveled, Herod wouldn't have been alarmed. And if Herod wasn't alarmed, Bethlehem wouldn't have lost its children. And of course, Jesus wouldn't have needed to flee to Egypt because he wasn't born. And so when we think like this, we can, everything that went wrong, we can say, well, that's God's fault. Right? Because the thing that started this chain of events was God. And look where we ended up. And people still think like this, don't we? Do we still think like this at times? Might we find ourselves thinking, if that snowstorm hadn't come at this time, I wouldn't be spending Christmas in the airport. Thanks, God. If that dictator had been deposed or given a heart attack, or an asteroid had landed on his palace, all those other people would still be alive. Thanks, God. If God would stop wars, mothers wouldn't cry over children. Refugees wouldn't be forced to flee their homes. Thanks, God. Are you on the job up there? Why is it like this? What are you doing? And so we can look around at the things that are wrong in our lives, the things that are wrong in our world, and say, God, why is this happening? And it's usually to God that we ask the question, isn't it? You see, it's interesting because we don't ever say, hey, Satan, why is all this bad stuff happening? But we will ask God, why is all this bad stuff happening? Why don't you stop it? Why isn't life better? Why isn't the world better? And so just as at Jesus' birth, we can look at the mess and we can say, God, you kind of started this. And look how it ended. We can do that in our own lives, can't we? If I hadn't gone to that school, if I hadn't met that person, my life would have been different. Thanks, God. I shouldn't have taken that job. Why did you open that door for me? Look at all the pain and the struggles and the thanks, God. It's easy to fall into this line of thinking. And I think Matthew kind of lays it out that way, right? The birth of Jesus is not about the angel singing. It's about Bethlehem crying. Bethlehem grieving and weeping. And so I'm not here today to try and tell you that Joseph, Mary, and the Magi running for their lives was a good thing. I don't want to persuade you that the deaths of those boys, those children, somehow turned out for good. Rather, the scripture, I believe, confronts us with the messiness to Jesus' family and to the broader community. And rather than avoiding this aspect of the story or seeking to explain it, I believe that what Matthew does is to lay out the reason for the season. The reason that the world needed Jesus. The reason that Jesus came to earth, the reason that Jesus was in the manger is because these things happen. Is because this is the world that we live in. Because Herod wasn't just bad to those children in that town because Jesus was born there. Herod was bad to everyone. That was the world. The refugees, the Magi, and Jesus happened to flee. These things were happening all around them, whether it was the Roman armies that were spreading out over the world. It was just their life. This is the reason that Jesus came into this world. The world was and is broken. The world is filled with pain. We know that, don't we? The reason we have Christmas drives, the reason we have Santas ringing bells outside department stores collecting money is because the world is filled with hurts, with those who don't have, even as those who do have spend. The reason that we talk about peace at this time of year and tell stories of wars that maybe took a break is because the wars are continuing and we want the peace that we don't have. Amen. This is the reason for the season. That Jesus was needed in the mess that we've created through our sin and through our selfishness. Herod chose his course of action, not Jesus. You see, the arrival of Jesus in the world was an event. It was a good event. That the Magi chose to travel was a good thing. That they went to Herod's palace could have been a good thing. It's value neutral. It's what Herod did next that makes it a bad thing. Not what God did, not what Jesus did, but what Herod did. It's the soldiers that Herod sent that made their decisions. Saying, yes, of course we'll do that. That's our orders. We're just obeying our orders. And so there are these series of decisions that people make along the way that come to this climax with Jesus and his family running for his life to Egypt, with Bethlehem grieving and weeping. But it wasn't because God caused it. It was because sin was part of the story. And Jesus came to end that type of violence and self-centeredness. He came to provide an alternative path and ultimately to make forgiveness possible, even for someone like Herod, through Jesus' own eventual death. And this is the contrast that we see. That Herod represents earthly powers, earthly attitudes that seek their own well-being. And Jesus came to confront them. Jesus came to replace the grief, the emptiness, and the despair that they create with his gifts of love, joy, hope, peace, that all come from forgiveness. So Matthew's story, Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, I don't believe is one of despair. It's one of need. It's one of need. And as I said last week, there are times as we celebrate Christmas that snow seems very appropriate as we attempt to cover up the problems rather than address them. Jesus came to shine light in the darkness, to expose the sin, to expose the problems, and to provide an alternative. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ was born for us. Christ lived for us. Christ taught for us. Christ set an example for us. Christ inspired us. Christ died for us. Christ rose for us. Christ ascended for us. Christ sits on the throne for us, and Christ will return for us. And that started while we were sinners. Not just while we were sinners, but because we were sinners. Yeah. Because if we weren't, Jesus wouldn't needed to have become human. God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden and everything was hunky-dory. Right? They had the community. They had the relationship. But because we were sinners. And it's through this God demonstrates his love. When we have sin, when we have conflict, when we have grief, when we have isolation, when we have struggles in our lives, the thing we need to know most is that God loves us. And the birth of Jesus is no greater testament to God's love than that. That He came into our mess. He came because of our mess. And so have yourselves a very messy Christmas. Because that's why Jesus came.
Ba-dum-bum-bum